One of the most common questions I get whenever I share my work is on whether or not I give art or painting lessons. If you would also like to see detailed art tutorials from me, I've included in the description to this video a link to a simple questionnaire through which you can let me know what techniques, courses or topics in art you find most difficult or you'd like for me to help you understand. Check it out once again via the link below, and when the lessons are ready, you'll get a notification in your email which you can also enter in the same form. And with that, let's get on to today's video. The goal for today's painting will be to combine these two images, one being that of a Kikuyu warrior taken sometime between 1920 and 1929 according to my source material, which was a photography book by Nigel Pavit known as Kenya, a country in the making. The second image of Mt.Kenya is a much recent one taken in 2015, and I'll try and merge these two into something that approximates an old photograph that has been rediscovered after enduring quite a bit of damage. This means it's bound to be something of a challenging project, but I'll walk you through my thinking in each and every step. What you've been watching so far has been my creation of the grid, which is this mesh of rectangular boxes across the canvas, and these are meant to assure that my proportions will be more accurate than they would have been if I was painting this artwork freehand. By the time I'm painting this on canvas, I've already combined these two images on Photoshop, and so I have a reliable visual of the way I expect the final artwork to turn out. So on that image, I've drawn similar grids, and so I'm copying onto the canvas the relationship between those grids and the main contours in the image. I'm painting those contours or those lines using oils, which is a different kind of medium to the one that I've just used for the grid, which was chalk. The reason for that difference is because when I'm done painting the outlines, I would like to get rid of the chalk underneath, and it's easier to do that when the two of them are drawn and painted respectively using different mediums, as you'll see shortly. One of the effects that I want to create in this image is I want it to look like it's a tone photograph that's been rescued or rediscovered, and so the rugged or the irregular margins that I'm painting all around the canvas are going to be the edges of that tone picture. In the sections that demand a bit more accuracy, like the face of the warrior for instance, I've added some smaller grids, and this will reduce the amount of errors I can make with such sections. I can afford myself a bit more liberty when I'm painting sections like the contours of individual mountain ridges or the shape of certain rocks, as you'll see later, because in such sections, small mistakes don't massively alter the final image. I still try not to be too carefree even when painting things like landscapes, but with faces specifically, I like making as little mistakes as possible, and so I'll take as much precautions as I reasonably can to help minimize possible errors. When I'm satisfied with the outlines, in short, when I think I've painted all the lines that demarcates the borders between either different characters in the painting, like say the warrior in the background, or individual parts of these characters, like all the contours within the warrior or within the mountain or within the sky, I can then get rid of the grid since I don't need it anymore. The grid was drawn in chalk, and so using a brush that's been lightly filled with water, I can erase it without damaging or affecting the outlines in any way, even though the outlines haven't fully dried by now. Any potential damage, like the brush smearing the outlines, is avoided in this case because oil paints, of course being oil-based, are completely immiscible with and insoluble in water, and so the water can easily get rid of the chalk without affecting the oil outlines. I want the painting to finally look like a photograph that's been placed on top of a white surface, like a white wall. And so I'm going to start by painting that wall using white acrylics because I'd like for it to dry real fast. I'll explain why in just a bit. Even by this simple action, you can see just how it separates the photograph in the middle from the white wall behind it in such a clear way. The reason I'm using acrylic here is because I'd like for it to dry really fast, because I'll be using masking tape to cover it while painting the photograph in the middle. Since the wall in the back doesn't have any character, in other words it's a perfectly white surface with no stains or textures on it, it would be something of an unnecessary waste to use oil paints in it. I like using oil paints for the sections of a painting, as you see in the middle, that have a bit more detail in them. Of course, the photograph being on a wall will have to cast some shadow on the wall itself, depending on where the light is coming from. So in my concept of this image, I've placed the light right above the picture, which means underneath all the lower edges of these individual holes or of the entire picture, there will be something of a drop shadow that will appear on the wall. I'm assuming it's kind of a soft light, so I'm not going to give these shadows any sharp edges, and I'm instead going to blur them at the bottom. I'm using oil paints to do this, and I'm aware that this is something of a contradiction compared to what I said earlier, which is I used white acrylics because I didn't want oil paints to keep me waiting for long before I can use the masking tape. The grey oil paint that I'm using here will take about 10 hours to fully dry, which is definitely much longer compared to the 5 minutes or less that I had to wait for the acrylic to dry before this step, but nothing compared to the 5 or 6 days that I would have to wait for white oil paints to dry. So not all oil colors dry at the same rate. All acrylic paints dry at the same rate, but oil paints are a bit of a more complicated story. Some of the pigments come from rock and mineral sources, others come from plant sources, some are chemically or artificially created sources, some organic and inorganic, and so different oil colors will have different drying rates. And so when I can substitute oil for acrylics in some sections of a painting, especially for backgrounds or other flat surfaces like the wall behind this picture for instance, I always take that option. I also find it easier to create this feathery or this blurry kind of transitions using oils than I do with acrylics. With acrylics it's more of a struggle because they dry so fast that I don't have the time to blend them in and hide the sharp edges. I use masking tape to cover these sections, then lightly use a blade to cut through it, and I can do this without damaging the canvas because thanks to the silk vinyl layer of primer that's underneath the surface and of course the grey acrylic that you can see, the canvas is just tough enough that I can use a blade to tear through the masking tape without damaging any of the threads of the canvas. After similarly covering the warrior, I'll then be able to paint the sky and the mountain and the rocks in front of us without having to be extra careful around the edges because they'll be protected by the masking tape. Also, since I'm using large brushes in this section, it would have been difficult to avoid smearing the paint where it's unwanted. And so the sky and the hills in the background will come first since they are behind everything else, and afterwards I'll paint the mountain and the rocks in front of us before finally painting the warrior himself. The closer you get to where the viewer is, the more the amount of detail that will be visible to us, and so the average size of the brushes that I'll use will gradually diminish the more we approach the foreground. Since I'm combining two images that are markedly different in that one is an old monochromatic or one color photograph, whereas the other one is a more recent full colored photograph, I have to change one to make it fit with the other. So this could have been by coloring the warrior and making this a color photograph, but the path I've chosen has been to turn the colored photograph of Mt.Kenya into something of a sepia monochrome. There are a couple of reasons why I've chosen this approach, one of them being that all photographs were typically monochromatic or black and white, and so it would be much easier to believe that this image or this scene is from the 1920s that way, as opposed to if the whole thing was in HD and in full color. Of course, by 1920 or 1929, whenever this photo of the warrior was taken, color photography had already been invented. But at the time, color film and processing was super expensive, and so it wasn't much readily available in everyday photography as it is today. Also, since color photography was still in its inception, most color photographs were of really bad quality, so most photographers opted to use the safer option, which is monochromatic photography. A second reason why I went this route is because since the photo of the Kikuyu warrior is much older, its quality isn't that great as compared to that of the mountain, which in this scene was photographed in 2015, almost 90 years after the first one. And so if I were to colorize the warrior, I'd have to make up so much detail that I just don't have the information for. For instance, since I don't know the color of anything he's wearing, any attempt to colorize it will probably lead to some sort of historical inaccuracy. And so that way it's safer to decolorize the mountain, then combine the two that way. The brightest color that I'm using in this painting is this kind of cream that you see, and not white, even though the cream parts of the painting would have been white in the photograph when it was originally captured. And this is part of my attempt at trying to make it look believably old. Photographs generally tend to discolor with time due to various factors like poor storage, or if a photograph is exposed to direct sunlight, chemical reactions in the compounds of the photo paper, other environmental factors like dampness or staining, or just generally bad handling, which the image here clearly has gone through given even the state of the picture. Remember, I'm trying to make it look like it's torn, which itself is something of an indicator that the photograph wasn't properly stored. And so the discoloration is very much in line with that. When I'm satisfied with the landscape as a whole, I'll get rid of the masking tape in that section and finally start painting this warrior. And of course, when painting him, I'll also mask out the sword he's holding, since it's easier to paint over the masking tape than to carefully avoid encroaching into those sections in a straight line. That's normally easier when the elements in the painting are more organically shaped, but for geometric shapes like that of this spearhead, they're only easier to navigate with the aid of something like masking tape or sometimes a ruler. As to why I wanted to paint this warrior in this particular location, my concept was to show somebody who needed some quiet time and so has gone to a place where he normally finds that kind of peace and tranquility. Of course, other questions might arise, like, for instance, why is he that high up in the mountain with such light dressing? It must be cold up there. But you can see he's not actually at the peak, it's quite far away. In the image I used from 2015, it's not that easy to tell the height of where the foreground is compared to the peak, so I'm just assuming it's just far away, that it's not as cold as it would be up there. Mt.Kenya is also an important place and a sacred and almost a revered place for the Kikuyu and other ethnic groups and tribes around the mountain. And this is for various reasons, one of them being that, of course, it's the place where their ancestors settled in almost 300 or 400 years ago, and so it gives them a sense of belonging, and they have that kind of attachment to it as you would have with your home. There's also something of a religious aspect to the mountain, or rather to its relation with the Kikuyu, since their spiritual beliefs, especially in ancient times, included revering and worshipping different types of supernatural beings. One of them was their ancestors, who were believed to reside under the earth. Others were various gods, some of whom didn't have names or forms, but there was a supreme god who presided, or who presides over all these gods, whose name is Ngai, and Ngai is believed to live on the mountain. Other supernatural beings that were recognized by the Kikuyu, or that have been recognized by them, are evil spirits who mean harm to the people. And for all these supernatural beings, their ancestors, the gods, and the evil spirits, certain offerings and rituals are normally observed, either to appease them or to communicate with them in one way or another. For the ancestors and for the evil spirits, these rituals like offerings or sacrifices or dances or certain incantations can be made in different places depending on the ancestor or the spirit you're trying to communicate to, or that the elders will be trying to communicate to. But specifically for the supreme god Ngai, all communication to him used to be directed towards Mount Kenya. And so for these two reasons, among others, the mountain is a very important formation to the Kikuyu and to other tribes around it. And so it could be for these or for any other reasons that our warrior here has made his way up the mountain. The process I'm using to paint him isn't that dissimilar to how I've painted the rest of the artwork, so I'm going to catch up with you as soon as we move on to something different. Now that I'm satisfied with the way the image looks, I'm gonna try and add a bit more effects to make it look even older and more damaged than it already does. First, I'm gonna add some stains to it. There could be stains of soup or discolored ink or even products of some chemical reactions. I'm using very soft and generally large brushes for this, and of course I'm applying these when the painting is completely dry, because otherwise these yellow stains, or at least the color of the stains, would mix with the monochromatic sepia that I've used for the photograph, and so they wouldn't appear yellow or yellowish at all. I'm also adding some darker stains, which in my mind could be mud that was later wiped off, and so they're not prominent enough to be so much of a distraction, but I'll make this more visible in the sky, since in the main part of the painting, which is the mountain and the warrior, you wouldn't really tell a difference between them and parts of the photograph itself. I also want to make the painting look like it's been burnt around the edges, and so I'll start by creating this brownish haze all around the edges, because as paper burns, after the volatile materials in it have been released as smoke and gas, the decomposed organic material that's left behind, which was used to create the paper in the first place, which is trees, normally tends to have a brownish kind of hue. Paper also has a component called lignin that turns brown as it decomposes under heat, and so for these reasons we'll have this brown wash all around the edges, but then the sections that have been completely burnt or that have nearly turned to ash will appear much darker. The final effect I'll try to create for this photograph, at the risk of overdoing it, is to try and make it look like it was crumpled up, then restretched, at least for display on this white wall. I won't drape it too much, or rather I won't give it too many creases, since it's clearly gone through enough. And so after indicating just a few major folds and furrows, it will be time to finally get rid of the tape and appreciate the painting in all its damaged splendor.
We're not taking anybody's guns away, so stop with the continuous lying about this stuff. As it relates to the Affordable Care Act, understand, let's just look at the history to know where people stand. When Donald Trump was president, 60 times he tried to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. 60 times. I was a senator at the time.